Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome to another episode of Sree's Global COVID-19 Show. My name is Sree Sreenivasan, and welcome to a very special episode 286. We're talking about going back to school. Columbia Law School Center for Public Research and Leadership has a major new report out in time for back to school season here in the United States. It's called Fundamental 4. Pandemic Learning Reveals the Value of High-Quality Instructional Materials to Educator-Family-Student Partnerships. You're going to meet one of the co-authors, and you can ask her anything. Our guest is Elizabeth Chu, the Executive Director of CPRL and a lecturer at Columbia Law School. Dr. Chu will be with us in just a moment. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. It's great to have you here. So much going on with this pandemic. We could talk about what's happening in Afghanistan. We could talk about the vaccine situation here, and we will touch upon at least the vaccine part because we're talking about back to school and what's happening. If you haven't seen the show before, I'm Sree Sreenivasan, and I'm the Marshall Loeb Visiting Professor of Digital Innovation at the Stony Brook School of Communication and Journalism. And we've been doing the show for over a year. First, we did it every single day for 250 days, and now we're doing it about once a week. Let me tell you a little bit about the company that brings this to you, Digimentors. We're so glad to be able to do shows like this for other companies, for organizations. We do university events, we do conferences, summits, webinars, talk shows, and unfortunately, people are still needing our services, and it's a real pity because this pandemic could have been over by now, but instead, because of misinformation, disinformation, vaccine hesitancy, we're in this terrible, terrible situation. If you know anybody who needs help putting together their conference or virtual event or hybrid event, please ask them to get in touch. Let's tell you a little bit more about this show. In the first 275 episodes, we've had more than 1.5 million viewers and 525 guests. 303 of them have been women, and yes, we counted, including the chief scientist of the World Health Organization. We're able to do this show because of our partnership with Scroll.in and Scroll Global. And we could not be doing the show without our friends, the producers, Rose Horowitz at Rose Horowitz 31 and Vandana Menon, Vandana_Menon. Please follow both of them, and they'll be live tweeting and sharing what's happening as well. I want to just show you just a handful of our recent episodes so you get a sense of the kind of work we've been doing. We had Adam Server on, whose big best-selling book, The Cruelty is the Point, really looks at the Trump administration and the Trump era. We also had Nightmare Scenario with Yasmin Abu Taleb and Damian Paletta. This is about the Trump administration's response to the pandemic that changed history, and Rose was the host of that show. And then we had Dr. Faisal Khan on with us about fighting the virus and the lies from St. Louis with Aisha Sultan, and Dr. Faisal Khan is the director of St. Louis County Department of Public Health. So we are doing so many great episodes with fantastic speakers. We'd love to hear from you. Tell us where you're watching from, and please share your questions. We'd love to ask our guest everything about going back to school. So with that, let me remind you again that our guest is Elizabeth Chu. She's the Executive Director for Columbia Law School's Center for Public Research and Leadership. And she is going to be talking about her big new report, The Fundamental 4. And we are so grateful to her for being with us here tonight. So hello.
Hello, and thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
We are so thrilled that you could spend some time with us. My first question always, how are you? Where are you? And how's your family been handling the pandemic?
Thanks so much for asking. I am doing okay. I'm in Minnesota right now visiting my parents. This is where I grew up. I think like a lot of people, childcare, I have 3 children, has been a challenge. And August is always a hard time in New York City where I live because a lot of the things shut down in any normal year. So it's even harder this year. So we decided to spend some time with my parents, and they're helping take care of the kids while I work.
Are you in your childhood bedroom at any point?
My kids are sleeping in my childhood bedroom. And right now I'm trying to hide out while they're all in the other room, hopefully entertaining themselves.
What is that like, by the way, to have your kids in your childhood bedroom?
They love it. And they especially love going through all of our drawers and our bookshelves and all the things from when we were little, especially now that they've become, at least my third grader has become quite a reader. And so he's found lots of treasures from when I was a kid.
That's lovely. I grew up the son of diplomats, so I lived in 7 countries in my 18 years.
Oh, wow.
And so that was, that's not possible for me really to have that kind of same experience. But thank you. And what's it like in Minnesota nowadays with the with the pandemic and vaccines? Are you tracking any of that?
The hospitals are filling up here in the Twin Cities to some extent. And so, of course, people are trying to be careful. There's a lot of outdoor activity, a lot of people wearing masks inside, a lot of people hoping that, everyone's going to take care of themselves and take care of their community so that we can stay on a more optimistic path and not go back to where we've been given the rising levels and high caseloads that we're seeing all across the country here in the U.S.
And are you optimistic that things will get better?
I have to be. At CPRL, where I work, one of our core values is optimism. And so we think, even the toughest problems require that people who are trying to fight them believe that there can be solutions, and we just have to take one step at a time. So I'm not ready to give up on that quite yet.
Wonderful. And that gives me a great excuse to start talking about the Center for Public Research and Leadership, and we'll get to the report that you're here to talk about. But tell us what the center is and how it fits in the law school, and what is your work there, and something about your team and colleagues, et cetera.
Thank you so much for asking. So we are the Center for Public Research and Leadership. We're housed at Columbia Law School. We go by CPRL. We have a dual mission, which is that we try and change education. And we work in the U.S. education system and in the Brazilian education system so that it is more equitable and serves all kids, so that they have an opportunity to have equal and just outcomes. To do that, we train the next generation of education system leaders, and we engage those future leaders in our research and consulting work so they take true ownership over the work and learn all of the skills that they'll need so that they can become leaders and influencers like you, Sree, and so many of your listeners out there when they grow up someday. So we work with law students, business students, education students, policy students, and data sciences students from over 25 graduate schools across the country.
That's amazing. Do you find that certain kinds of law school students are attracted to the work that you do, and how does it fit in? It's an elective kind of work that they choose to work with you, is that right?
Law school students fit in because in many ways we're doing what law school students do so much in the corporate sector. We are helping organizations, education systems, nonprofits, advocacy organizations figure out how to set goals, how to get all the people who are trying to achieve those goals moving in the same direction, and how to maximize their outcomes, which in our case, in the public education system, are things like learning. Of course, in the corporate world, that's things like profits. And so, we need law students who think about that very intentional structuring of systems to participate in our program. So that's one whole reason why law school students participate. Another whole reason is because to tackle some of the deeply entrenched issues that we're talking about, we need legal research and legal strategies. We don't go to litigation as the go-to, but we know that litigation is sometimes an avenue that we want to pursue when we're thinking about some of our deepest and most lasting issues. And so for those reasons, law school students are really attracted to what we do. About 40% of the students who participate in our program are law school students, and we see them out in the field. Over 2/3 of our over 500 graduates are out in the field in the education sector in the US and abroad, making these changes on behalf of kids.
Oh, that sounds just fantastic. So let's talk about this big new project and the report that you've put together, and explain the kind of the genesis of it and what the fundamental four are.
So this past year has been so challenging and yet so rewarding for us as a center. We spent the last year studying pandemic schooling to do two really big things. The first was to help kids, families, educators just meet the moment and make it through a very, very challenging year. And a lot of that work meant that we spent a lot of time with families trying to understand what they were doing to innovate and help their kids learn. And then in turn, providing resources based on what we've learned so we can spread knowledge knowledge about what works across families across the United States, the whole time focusing on the families that were most disproportionately harmed by the pandemic itself. And then the second thing is that we wanted to figure out how to build a stronger and more equitable education system moving forward, trying not to let this crisis go to waste, since in fact we were in a crisis. And so in the fall, when we were conducting dozens of interviews with families, and we had families together in focus groups, we had a lot of families from many different schools and many different districts coming together in the same focus groups. And what we started to hear was a couple of things. Number one, a loud and clear reporting that families are at the heart of teaching and learning. And a lot of the families that we were interviewing and speaking to were Black families, brown families, low-income families, families that have traditionally really been left out of the instructional process. And here they were put right center in the middle of it. And then the second thing is that we heard these families, as they were talking across schools and districts, describing vastly different experiences. The families who had access to high-quality, tech-enabled materials were talking about how easy, in some ways, I wouldn't want to say easy, writ large, but easy, relatively speaking, it was for them to support their kids, versus the families who didn't have access to these materials, talking about how they were staying up. They were going on Pinterest and YouTube and Facebook and looking for things that they could do for their kids who they so desperately wanted to learn this year. And so based on those early focus groups, what we decided to do was do a very intensive study of the family role in education this year, and the role that materials played in facilitating family involvement in the teaching and learning process. And so we ended up conducting nearly 300 interviews with families, educators, instructional leaders in 9 systems across 7 states. And the result was the Fundamental 4 report that you just mentioned.
All right, before we go into the Fundamental 4 and we look at it together and you help break that down a little more, I want to tell everybody this is Dr. Elizabeth Chu, and she is in her family home in Minnesota, and she has kids somewhere safely, not interfering with her late evening time. So I don't know how long we even have her, but we're so grateful. Tell us where you're watching from. Please ask any questions, and please tell friends who have children or grandchildren who will be really curious about this family partnership with educators, how that can work. So let's welcome some of our friends who are watching. Joe Appio says hello on Twitter. Neil Parekh is watching from Springfield. Neil is Vice President of Digimentors, and he says on Tuesday he celebrated his 1-year anniversary of working full-time with us. So that's so great, Neil, and thank you for being part of the family. And Jonathan Borstein is with us. He's watching from the East Village. He's watched every single episode. Elizabeth, it's mind-boggling. No one in my own family has done even close to what he's done. So, and he's a former guest on the show and just a dear friend. Thank you, Jonathan. He's talking about. He says we should talk about not just vaccines, but also booster shots, because those are also in the news. And Paula Kiger, who's also on our Digimentors team, is watching from Tallahassee, Florida. And I want to ask Liz what she thinks of the news about how the governments are intersecting with boards of education and what her thoughts are on that. And Stephen Kaplan's watching from Ramsey, New Jersey, also part of the Digimentors family and someone who has his own wonderful online shows as well. And watching all the way from Kerala, India is Cherry. And Cherry says, Happy Onam. That's our harvest festival and start of the new year in Kerala, India. And so I don't know if you've been to India, Liz, but you'll put it on your bucket list. And Rose, of course, is here. And Rose is also the producer of the show with Vandana. And she has her own show about women to follow. And everyone, please check out her hashtag, Women to Follow. I've been talking a lot of social media stuff here. Liz is not a social media person, so she reads more, is just a better developed person than the rest of us who are obsessed with social. So I'm always happy to meet someone who is not on social. Her kids will be on social maybe before her, or she'll have to join to watch what they're doing. But thank you again, Liz, for being here. I'm going to show the four concepts, and if you can just talk us through them individually so everybody can understand, and where they can find this report is also important.
Great. So the last question is the easiest, and I'll say it first in case people want to follow along as they're watching your show. The report is available on our website at CPRL. That's cprl.law.columbia.edu because we're at the Columbia Law School. And so, as you said, we had 4 big takeaways that we wanted to put clearly out to education systems, because there is a real opportunity to improve based on the crisis moving forward and really do things differently. So the first is to expand the dimensions of high quality instructional materials, or people might be more familiar with the term curriculum, but in education, we often think about high quality curriculum as being curriculum that is coherent, curriculum that's aligned to state standards, curriculum that's logically sequenced for kids, and all of those things are incredibly important. We also think it is really, really important that the curriculum is tech enabled, so that kids can continue to learn across the boundaries of school and home, that it is culturally responsive, so that it speaks to all of the cultures that we see in our schools, and that it's educative for families. And so we saw this past year that the curriculum that was most supportive of student learning was those curriculums that were set out to help families help their kids in the learning process. And so we encourage school systems to think about adopting this broader definition of high quality. The second thing is not to give up on this idea of students, teachers, and families working together to support teaching and learning. And that is incredibly important across all races and income levels, because like I said, historically, we've seen much, much less of that in low income families and schools and in Black and Brown communities. And so in this case, there's a real opportunity to take these high quality materials and have the 3 sets of people, the students, the families, and the teachers working together to make sure that kids are learning at the very best levels. The third is just to acknowledge that teachers have a lot of expertise, but with these materials, they have the opportunity to increase their professionalism, work together, have professional learning that helps them harness the power of these materials and helps them do that in partnership with families. One of the things that we heard from all of the families in our study was this idea that a lot of teachers really haven't been trained to partner with families around student learning, particularly when there's cultural mismatch between the teachers and the families that they're working with. And so teachers would welcome the opportunity for professional learning that helps them learn how to create these partnerships and sustain them. And then the last thing was not to put this all on the teachers, but to think about the systems and structures that surround our classrooms and our schools so that teachers, families, and students can continue to be engaged together, again, around teaching and learning, not trying to family-proof the school, not trying to create systems that just enable families to bring kids to school and let them go, but actually allow families to be part of the instructional process.
Thank you. That's a lot of material to digest, and we'll encourage everyone to go to cprl.law.columbia.edu and check out the project there, and just search. I'm sure if you'll search Fundamental 4 and Columbia Law School also, it'll come up. So I'm a parent who is so busy, I don't have time to read all this stuff. What is a takeaway that I can absorb now that, at the breakfast table with my spouse or with a friend at work, I can pass on this nugget of information?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we've been encouraging a lot of the families that we work with is to realize that they themselves have a benefit to their children. And it's both a direct benefit because of the connection that they have in helping their children learn. And there's this indirect benefit that's available to them because we've seen over the past year that when these partnerships were in place, families partnering with teachers help teachers become better. And then there's the indirect benefit because families help teachers get better and then teachers serve their kids better. And we think it's really important that families all across the US and globally realize that they have this power and they should harness it, and they have a right. They have a right to these types of partnerships that we've typically seen in, like I said, middle and upper middle class, wealthier neighborhoods, often whiter neighborhoods in the United States. It should be available to all.
Yeah, and that's partly what hasn't happened. For those who haven't been paying enough attention to the schools debate that's going on, can you kind of give us an observation of what the dynamics are? Those of us in New York City, the K through 12 schools open kind of closer to Labor Day, and so school season hasn't quite started for most of us. But in other parts of the country, schools have already been in session for a week or two. So we're seeing lots of buzz and lots of animosity and problems. So if you can help us understand some of that.
Yeah, there's a lot of debate going on right now. I would say there are two topics, neither of which was the focus of this study. One is around masks and public health and vaccinations and all of those sorts of things just related to public health. And then the second, we're seeing a lot of debates around critical race theory. And like I said, neither of those were the focus of this report. And interestingly enough, with the superintendents in the districts that we work with now, we've heard a lot of comments about how neither of those things were controversies last summer. And in fact, last summer, a lot of the superintendents were really worried that these public health mandates, the masks and the social distancing, would have been controversial, particularly the masks. And what we've been hearing from a lot of superintendents is that although they spent a lot of time thinking that masks were going to be an issue last year, they in fact weren't. There were other issues that they might not have anticipated, but it wasn't masking. And this year, in fact, the masking, people have fatigue, people are tired, people want their kids to learn. There's a whole lot of politics going on, and the masking and the other public health measures have definitely risen up to the top as a major topic of discussion.
If you were queen of all education in America, what are some things you would do to make things better for the school year?
I'm going to sound like I'm beating the same drum, but really it's around the family partnership. I think especially as this school year looks like it's going to be more uncertain than we may have previously predicted, the close communication and close relationship that we saw in school districts between teachers, families, students, and administrators in many cases should not go away, because that is something that created a strength and a level of drive and determination to get through what was an incredibly challenging year. So we are encouraging the districts that we're working with to think about how they can create and sustain the strong partnerships that they had from last year into this year, engage families in the learning, welcome families into the teaching and learning process, continue that authentic communication, support families, and continue using tech-enabled instructional materials so that we're prepared for whatever shocks may come up over the course of what is turning out to be quite an uncertain school year. I'll also say that partnering with families turned out for the teachers in our study to be a really close at hand way to help them engage in instruction and teaching that spoke to the kids' cultures and backgrounds and helped broaden kids' worldviews. And that's something that teachers said was really, really important. And I think especially in a moment like this, when so much is happening in the world around race and conflict, continuing to learn about other cultures, continuing to learn about the needs and the interests and the cultures of the communities that you're serving, and then tailor your instruction remains really, really important.
Thank you. That is such valuable insight and information. We've been seeing cover stories in magazines and in other places, headlines about the lost year. And, academically, do you think it has been a lost year for most people? We've seen stories of 20% of students never checked in when it was remote learning. And so I want to hear your thoughts on looking back, and then what are the lessons from looking back that we can help in looking forward?
Yeah, well, there's no question that last year was so hard for so many children and so many families and so many teachers and so many leaders as well. But there's definite hardship that has happened with kids, and we can't ignore the high numbers of kids who simply were not engaged in schooling over the course of the past year. We've heard a lot of things from families around how to understand the idea of learning loss, and a couple of the more optimistic comments that we've heard loud and clear across all of our interviews was one, a desire to recognize all of the things that kids in fact did learn over the course of a challenging year, even if some of it wasn't about academic standards. And that's not to diminish the importance of learning the academic content, but it's just that families are saying that in addition to this repeated statements about how much learning their kids didn't achieve, also to recognize the things that their kids and their families did achieve. The second thing, and one of the things that we found really, really interesting about this report, is that across all of the interviews that we conducted, in this case, almost 300, all stakeholders reported that kids learned as much or more than a typical year when teachers, families, and students were working together using the high quality curriculum that we saw in place in the districts that we were studying. And that's really tremendous. A lot of the stories right now are so focused on the negative. We wanted to figure out where was learning happening and what can we learn from that to help build a stronger education system. And we saw that when there was this fundamental four, when you had the teachers, the families, the students with the strong curriculum, kids were learning at really high levels. And those claims were supported by assessment data, by student portfolio work, lots of things. So this wasn't just an off-the-cuff sort of response that teachers and families and administrators were giving, but they had real evidence to support the claims that they were making.
Thank you. Since we have the fundamental four up again, if you can explain to us the four that bring these together. So just go through that one more time, please.
Yeah, well, so it might be a little bit insider baseball, but in education, until this year, a lot of teacher training, a lot of educators think about three things helping students at the point of learning: curriculum, teachers, and students. And when you want to think about how to help kids learn more, you think about, how do I improve the curriculum? How do I improve the teaching? How do I improve the way those two things work together with the students so that we can increase learning? What we're putting forward was the fact that over this past year, we saw that when learning worked, looking at those three pillars was insufficient. To understand where learning happened, you had to add this fourth essential pillar, and that was the family. And so now, over the past year, if you wanted to think about how can we help kids learn, you would have to look at the teacher, the student, the family, and the curriculum, and the way those four things work together. And it turns out that having high quality curriculum coordinated those activities in a year where all other means of coordination that we've typically relied upon in schooling was unavailable to so many kids across the United States. We didn't have the building itself, we didn't have the schedules, we didn't have the Carnegie units in many cases, and all of those sorts of things. And in the absence of that, the curriculum stepped in when the curriculum was high quality, and then these three actors could work together to support kids learning. And in fact, kids did learn at high levels when Fundamental 4 was in place.
Well, I hope that this is a movement of the Fundamental Four so that everybody can benefit, all the kids and the parents and the families and the teachers, of course, too. You want to talk for a minute about your co-authors?
Sure. I would love to talk about Andrea and Grace. The three of us are on the team together at Columbia Law School at CPEARL. Andrea has been with us for probably about 4 years now. I'm smiling so big because I hope she's listening to this. Andrea knows that when she walked in to interview with us, I knew on the spot. She's one of those people I knew on the spot. She had to come be part of the CPEARL team. She is a brilliant and a brilliant thinker and a beautiful writer, which I think shines through in the report. Grace was one of our students, which is another really fun story. She's on our team now at the law school, but she was in our program thinking about, she's an NYU law student. I want to be a lawyer someday. I really want to affect education. I want to build a more equitable education system. How can I do that? We saw her potential right away, convinced her to stay on with us after her program was over, and she was finishing out her time at NYU Law School, and then she, right after graduation, joined our team, and hopefully she hasn't looked back because we love having her as part of the CPEARL family.
That's great. We want to remind everybody they can find this report by going to cprl.law.columbia.edu, or just search CPRL and Columbia, you'll find it. And I'm just kind of scrolling through this. So if you want to just talk about what are some of the things that people find in the report, it's a 33-page report. What will they see if they get this?
Well, one of the things that I'll point out based
And
on
stop me as I'm going through. Just say Sree, stop, and I will.
Well, one of the things that you just had up that I think is really important, and it's a question we got a lot, is about where this report looked, what schools and what school systems we looked at in this report. And as I said earlier in your show, we studied 9 school systems across 7 states in the United States. And we spent a lot of time on site selection because, we've been talking about the controversies in schooling. So much of the time when you give recommendations around schooling, people say, well, that doesn't apply to me. That's about charter schools. That's about traditional public schools. That's about schools in the Northeast. That's about schools in the Midwest, whatever it is. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about how we can get a diversity of locations, a diversity of size, diversity across charter and non-charter schools. We had schools in the rural South. We had big urban districts in the Midwest and the Northeast, so that when we put out the findings, people weren't able to say, oh, I don't see a district or a school system like mine in the report. In fact, we were hoping that everyone would be able to say, I can't say that I can't do that because that place actually does kind of look like my system and it worked there, so it could work for us. So that's one of the interesting things I think about the finding is there's really a very strong representation across the United States here.
That's great. And then this is what you were saying, the way of thinking about the 4 cores coming together.
Yeah. And so we were thinking here about the fact that, the relationship historically has actually looked pretty flat, teacher, student, instructional materials. And when you add the family, you actually can add a dimension to this idea of how teaching and learning occurs. And one of the things that we've heard a lot after releasing the report, and this is what I thought you were going to ask earlier, Sree, is families are busy. Can we really ask families to be part of the teaching and learning process? And what we're not saying is that families need to be teachers, but we do see that many families do have a role in what teaching and learning looks like in schools, and that should be available to all families in the United States, and it's a benefit to all kids when that happens. And so when you see that two-dimensional, the 3-dimensional figure, there might be times when kids are learning and they're just activating one side of the figure. It really is at that moment about the teacher, the student, and the curriculum. But then to keep the integrity of the core intact, you need the families to be part of that, because even if they're not there at that moment, they're informing how the relationship and the teaching and learning process works.
What about the superhero siblings?
Well, maybe I don't know if you had one of these in your house. I know you have a son who's going off to college.
Yeah, he and his twin are off to college. Yeah, and then I have a younger brother, so I don't know if I was a superhero to him. I was probably mostly just troubling him. The relationship between this, many years apart brothers is not always, when you're growing up, is not always as much fun as it is much later.
That's so true. Well, so what we saw this past year in a lot of families where there was often a middle school or a high school sibling, and then a younger child, is the important role that these older siblings played in supporting learning for the younger siblings in the household. And interestingly enough, this might resonate with people on the show who are from my generation, and older, is this, we saw this a lot in math. Kids in school learn math in a different way now than I learned math when I was in school, and that many current parents learn math. And so parents often can struggle in helping their kids learn conceptual math, which is what occurs now in schools. And so we saw many stories, heard many stories about older siblings play a crucial role in supporting their younger siblings in the learning process. And so when we say family is part of the instructional core, we chose the word family intentionally because families look different across cultures, they look different across communities. And, we don't want to put out the idea that it has to be a biological parent who's playing this role. In fact, we saw lots of different types of family members playing this role, whether it was an older sibling or an auntie or a grandfather, or, whoever it may be.
Here's Jonathan, who says, I taught my sister to read when she was 4 and I was 6. What a superhero sibling that is.
I wish I had that same type in my house.
And Paula's stepping away, but she says, thanks for a great thought-provoking show. We really appreciate everyone who's watching. We've got just a couple of minutes left, so if you have a question, please throw it in here. We'd love to ask Dr. Chu. And Linda says, great topic. Here's a question from Rick Botello, who says, this sounds great in theory, but what about educational inequities within single-parent families with low incomes? The last year is especially challenging for low-income families. How can we address these inequities where families and teachers are disconnected?
Yeah, well, I think what we're advocating for is more connection, and it's such an interesting comment, because it is one of the things that we've heard a lot. You know, what about families who might not have the resources or the ability to participate in the instructional process? And you know, what we've been saying is, when we look at education, what we've heard is that families said this past year, and almost all the families that we interviewed were families who identified as Black, brown, low income. This is a welcome way that schools are treating us. It's different than it was before, and it had a positive impact on my kids. And teachers were saying, this is welcome, it's different, and it had a positive impact on me. And so what we're saying is, take the good and figure out how to do more of that good. Don't turn away just because we can't solve poverty or homelessness or child welfare. The question is, how can you take that strong relationship that worked for so many kids and make it accessible to more kids? Just in the same way, when we see other goods, you know, we try and spread those. We don't say, just because it doesn't work for some, we can't do it for anyone. Let's say this was working for many, many kids, significant proportions of kids across the country. How can we make it available and make sure that the very common here that families and teachers are disconnected is not the case? And one very interesting thing that we really hadn't anticipated was the fact that curriculum can help make this connection. It's part of the reason why we advocated for a new definition for high quality curriculum. These high quality curriculum can facilitate school family partnerships. So that doesn't have to all be on the teachers, doesn't have to all be on the families. You can actually have tools that enable that process, and then systems that help support the people who are engaged together.
That's so important. And I hope everybody who is reluctant to try new things sees the value in that. And I think Dr. Chu has done a really good job explaining it. So again, folks, please go to cprl.law.columbia.edu or Google CPRL Columbia. And then on the website, you will see this report. You put this together and you started working on it during the pandemic, like last year's pandemic. And then how did this all come together in the end?
Well, lots of hard work by Andrea, Grace, a team of students, and myself. I think, you know, as researchers, so often in social science research, there's such attention to getting every single word right. And there can be such a delay in putting out the findings. And I think what we were trying to do is draw inspiration from the sense of urgency and the dedication that we saw in the K-12 education system, and bring that to ourselves and realize that, you know, we can't sit around as researchers having the luxury of saying, well, we could publish this in a couple of years. Instead, we set a goal to get it out this summer in the hopes that with all of the stimulus dollars that are flooding into systems right now at such an unprecedented level, we can put out some really concrete recommendations for systems so that they can build on these learnings, and that we're not putting out the report at a time when it's too late to actually act on the key takeaways.
I just want to say that Craig Newmark, who does an incredible job supporting teachers all throughout the year, he works with Donors Choose and so many other programs. He just retweeted the show. So we've got a whole bunch of new people who just flooded in. I hope lots of teachers are watching. What is your message to teachers? Should they be downloading this report? Should they be emailing it to their superintendents, sending it to their principals? What is your message to the teachers who are watching now and the people who love teachers?
Absolutely. We would love that. We think we've heard from a lot of teachers who participated in the study how valuable this is. From other teachers out there, it's so valuable. What we saw is, first of all, thank you, teachers. What an incredibly challenging year it was for all of you. And we heard such appreciation for the heroic efforts that teachers went to from the families who we interviewed. And we witnessed that ourselves from our observations and in our conversations over the past year. Building on the thank you, I think families want more of this, and families want teachers' jobs to be sustainable and to be spent on the highest leverage, highest impact activities. And what we heard from teachers is that their job could easily be on a 100-hour-a-week job. And in fact, having materials that give them a strong foundation to work from so that they can be treated like professionals, like so many other professions out there that have a shared knowledge base and a shared set of tools so that they can do the activities that make the most sense for them. Get those materials in teachers' hands so they can be, professionalized and treated as professionals like the other professions that are out there, and spend their time on the high leverage activities, tailoring those materials to their students, partnering with families around the student learning process, meeting students in their one-to-one needs, all of those types of things. We encourage teachers to read this report, think about the tools that they should be getting with their ARP ESSER dollars and the other stimulus money, putting in place these systems to allow them to continue these authentic partnerships and support student learning. But again, biggest takeaway, thank you, teachers, for everything that you did over the past year.
Of course, we want to say that to all the teachers who are working so hard and are now, and this is not over, right? Like, that's the thing. Today I saw a meme that everyone is talking about, like 2020 was peak problems, but like 2021 is worse. That's what people haven't quite understood. We're acting like the pandemic's over, and
Right.
instead we're seeing how much of a problem it still is.
Right.
As we wind up here, folks who have just joined us, the report you see on the screen is called Fundamental 4, Pandemic Learning Reveals the Value of High Quality Instructional Materials to Educator, Family, and Student Partnerships. And you can find that on the cprl.law.columbia.edu. Yes, it's part of Columbia Law School Center for Public Research and Leadership. And Dr. Chu is executive director there and one of the lecturers at Columbia Law School. She's the co-author of this report with two other folks she gave a very nice shout out to. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to come back to her in a minute to give us some final thoughts and give hope for the teachers, give hope for the families, and give hope for the children about this coming year. But before that, I'm going to give her a chance to just think about that and just remind all of you that this is a show that we do every week. And we're so grateful for all your support. And it's part of a slew of things we do at Digimentors. Coming up this Sunday, we will have another episode of the New York Times Read Along. The Read Along is something that we've been doing for almost 6 years now. And it is, we read the Sunday New York Times out loud like crazy people. And we've been doing it for all these years. And this week we have on Sunday at 8:30, author, poet, and former Metro reporter for the New York Times and the co-author of Breaking Barriers, How P-TECH Schools Create a Pathway from High School to College to Career. Tina Kelly will be with us. So that's at 8:30 a.m. Sunday. It's all recorded on all the channels on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. As soon as we're off the air, it will rerun. So I hope you will catch it then if you're not a Sunday morning person on East Coast time. And on Sunday after that, we host She's on Call, a fantastic show with Drs. Sujana Chandrasekhar and Marina Kurian. They're two surgeons, and this time they're doing back to school for year 2. And they have some fantastic guests as well, including the president of the National Association of School Nurses. We're so excited about this. That's at 11 a.m. Eastern. She's on Call. Search it everywhere. And our own producer, Rose Horowitz, who works on both those shows, has another great show coming up on Tuesday. A women's activist at UN Women will be her guest. Verlaine Diane Subriyudu will be with us, and she will be interviewed by Rose. So you want to check that out. She's the author of Unbound, Twitter Thoughts for the Heart and Mind. So do check out all of these shows that are coming up. So now we're going to go back to our guest for today, Dr. Elizabeth Chu, who's been so patient and so insightful for us, giving us lots of tips. I asked her to now close the show by giving us some thoughts for the family members, the teachers, and the students. Give us hope for this year. And you.
Well, again, thank you for having me this evening. I would just reemphasize some of the things that we spoke about already. Number one, to all the families out there, all families here in the United States, in India, wherever you are watching the show, have a role and a benefit to play and to give in your children's education system, and that's in the teaching and learning process. So we're trying to advocate that we don't go back to the world in which we see families removed to more superficial types of involvement in their kids' education. So families, you have a role to play. There's a direct benefit to your kids when you're involved, and there's this indirect benefit because teachers report that they became stronger teachers by partnering with families. The second thing is for the educators out there and people in the education system, advocate for these high quality materials. Yes, those that are standards aligned. Yes, those that are logical and coherent, but also those that are tech enabled, that are culturally responsive, and those that are supportive to families. Use this federal stimulus money to buy those materials, to get them in place in your schools, to get the systems and processes in place to support teachers in using them, and to support teachers in partnering with families so that we can continue harnessing the power of the fundamental for moving forward and making sure that the increased learning that we saw where it did occur, where the fundamental four was intact, the students, the families, the teachers, and the materials together, we can see that moving forward even after we come out of the crisis.
Thank you. And good luck to all the teachers, all the students, all the families, and good luck to you in your academic work this year, Dr. Chu. We're very grateful to you and for everyone who's been watching, and we look forward to seeing you on another episode, folks. You can find all our archives on youtube.com/Sreenet, and I think Dr. Chu has bedtime and other activities